A very warm welcome to everyone tuning in for a new episode on Beyond the Battlefield, a podcast about CIMIC and everything that is connected to it. I'm Sonia, your host, and today we're talking about climate change and what it means for CIMIC and all the CIMIC skills and tasks that we have. So, welcome everyone. I have a special guest today with me online from the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence in Canada, Emil. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today talking about the very important topic of climate change. But before we dive into it, I would ask you to just give a quick introduction about yourself so our listeners know who they have sitting here with me.
Sure, pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Sonia. My name is Emil Havstrup. I'm a Concept Development and Experimentation Officer at CASCO in Montreal. CASCO is the Climate Change and Security NATO Center of Excellence. We deal with everything related to climate vis-a-vis defense and military stakeholders within the alliance. So we try to inform the alliance on how climate change acts as a threat multiplier, how it affects operations, how we need to account for it when planning, etc., etc. So my work really relates to both the concept development and experimentation pillars of how we operationalize the efforts to address climate change, while also looking at experimentation, new innovative ideas and technologies that for how we can tackle this issue.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. You already mentioned a lot of interesting points, but before we go deeper into that, I always wonder how climate change affects the security environment and what NATO is actually doing to tackle this problem. So I know a few years ago, there were already the first initiatives to have some strategic concepts, some guidelines developed during the NATO summit and so on. I also know the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence was accredited, I think, in 2024. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Very new.
Perfect. Can you tell us something about why it was established? Why did NATO decide on having this Climate Change Center of Excellence?
So the establishment of CASCO is strongly linked to the work that was happening internally at NATO, where an increasing number of member states, allies, and staff started to see this interlinkage between climate change and the work that NATO does. So we've had the Climate Security Action Plan, which outlines in great detail the impact that climate change has on the alliance. It provides a lot of concrete steps for what the alliance should do to address it. As part of that leg of work, Canada as a framework nation helped set up the Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence to sort of galvanize and collect a lot of the efforts done by the Alliance on this, in a similar way that you have for a lot of other centers of excellence. So we're still new and we're feeling our feet or getting a feeling for what exactly our role will be. But we've already contributed to several projects within NATO. We've contributed to the B Strategic Report, which outlines sort of the strategic implications for climate change and sort of sketches out what do we know, what's the threat. And now we're working on an operational concept which is more aimed towards operationalizing what we know about climate change and its effect on the alliance and what concrete steps we take towards addressing it. But already a lot of work is being done, both within the alliance itself, but also among allied nations themselves. So there's multi tracks of work ongoing, and CASCO sort of features into it as a knowledge hub and bridge between different worlds that can sort of serve as a repository of knowledge and as an advisory body to help inform some of the decisions to be made.
Mm-hmm. You already mentioned that there are several threats that are connected to climate change that you also identified in your concepts and, all the strategic papers. Can we talk a little bit more about those threats? What specific threats are there that the military or, NATO in general has to adapt to in the future?
There's a lot and it depends. Some good examples have been the progressive sea level rise linked to warming temperatures. So the fact that the oceans are the sea level is slowly rising means that coastal infrastructure is at risk. You have a lot of military bases. The most famous one being in Norfolk, USA. That's quite repeatedly flooded. That has quite a high level of risk towards flooding. You have a lot of infrastructure that's located in the Arctic that, due to the thawing permafrost, you need to rethink how exactly you're building bases and roads, airstrips up there. You have a lot of demand for military assistance due to the rising frequency of natural disasters. So climate change is making it more likely that you'll have forest fires, that you'll have flooding, and the military is increasingly being dependent upon by civil society or society as a whole to respond to some of these threats. So it really comes from all angles. It both affects how NATO operates in terms of how our forces, how efficient our forces are, and what our readiness level is. But it's also in terms of the exact role that the armed forces play in society. More so than ever before, you're seeing that armed forces are being called upon to respond to a wider variety of threats and issues.
I think I agree with you when it comes to, okay, what role has the military in? So, of course, it depends. The threats depend on what is my role as military and where am I operating. So I could also imagine that, especially for CIMIC now, because, we're talking mainly about CIMIC in this podcast, the roles might change a little bit. Also, the task that CIMIC is handling could change in the future with those rising threats with climate change. I wonder if we look at CIMIC, for example, in a stabilization operation somewhere in Mali, there we also have those specific threats coming out of climate change, like maybe some food insecurities. We have the higher temperatures and so on and so on. What do you think, or what is your take on this when it comes to the role of the military there, and especially within CIMIC? What do they have to face?
So, to quickly address it, I think it's very complicated. I think that in the past there's been a tendency to operate in silos, to have siloed approaches where you leave different parts of response to different institutions, and that you focus exclusively on your core focus. But I think that climate change has shown us that's not really possible. The fact that climate change acts as a threat multiplier across multiple different areas, that it exacerbates and worsens food insecurity, water insecurity, livelihood insecurity in general, you name it, that it's a driver of a lot of these destabilizing factors. That means that the way that you consider your role in areas that are experiencing these effects also needs to change. You cannot, as an armed force, operate. You gave the example of Mali. You cannot, as an armed force, operate in Mali without considering these external factors, because that just makes you inefficient. Then you're also exposing yourself to these risks. If you don't understand events developing in wider society, how are you supposed to protect it? Not that the military is supposed to solve all the world's problems, but you cannot exclude them when you're trying to address your core tasks. So that's part of it. When we give courses to military experts, we like to explain that that climate change isn't necessarily the military's issue to solve, but it is the issue that's determining to what degree are we ready, what degree are we able to continue operating, what degree are we able to fulfill our core mission tasks. If your core mission task is to act as a stabilizing force in the Sahel, then you also need to understand why climate change might be driving people to migrate to urban centers, why it might be causing pastoral farmer conflicts. That impacts the role that you play and the degree to which you'll be successful.
Yeah. I'm there with you. You also mentioned that climate change acts as a threat multiplier. It's not something that comes up and is the threat itself, but it multiplies what is already there and intensifies what is already there, all the problems that we have when it comes to food and water insecurity. I could also imagine that the climate change or the effects of climate change, especially in Mali and the Sahel zone, could also impact how CIMIC is talking, or to whom CIMIC officers are talking to. I would imagine that also the cooperation with, for example, humanitarian actors could be very different in this case, because they have more insights and different insights. But as you said, it's really not the military who solves the problem, but has to keep in mind for the planning, for the operation and everything itself. When we look not only on the stabilization operations, but also now on, for example, European territory, are there specific climate threats that we have to keep in mind when it comes to operational planning as well? Or is it is it harder to actually pinpoint something that is very important for us on European soil?
I think the threats that let me maybe start it with one clear fact. Climate change does not distinguish between nationality.
Yeah.
The effects of climate change are not the same in every region, but they often rhyme, and the factors are inextricably linked. And there's often spillover effects from one region to another that impact and cascade. Europe does face serious threats from climate security. I think the main difference is that Europe often has the resources to address these problems better than other parts of the world. Hence why they don't spiral out of control or manifest themselves as more wicked problems. The big threats that you have are really linked to water access. So Southern Europe is expected to desertify at a very, very high rate, experience more frequent forest fires. You have the threat of sea level rise in parts of Europe. You have the big kicker, and the one that surprised a lot of people, I think, has been the degree to which natural disasters are expected to worsen. You've experienced historic droughts, but also historic floods over the past few decades in Europe. And there's a lot of data to suggest that this is linked to the gradual temperature increases that that are caused by anthropogenic climate change. Yeah. So the fact is that Europe both has to contend with these slow-moving or slow-acting factors like heat that progressively get worse and worse and worse, while also contending with these sudden shock or rapid onset events like natural disasters that affect how we live, where we live, and put our lives at risk in many cases. Yeah. So that's sort of what Europe contends with here. The clear threat to Europe is very much this toxic combination that places an enormous strain on the resources that we have as a society have available.
So do you think that, because you mentioned that, for example, especially here on European or in the European area, we have different threats than on the African continent, for example. They are there, but they are different. With the heat slowly rising, and so on and so on. Do you think that the military here actually takes climate change and the implications of climate change seriously enough to adapt and prepare accordingly?
I think, first of all, I potentially disagree with the fact that the threats are different in Europe from other places. I think that they might not be as intense yet, but they are definitely there. The other element of your question regarding if militaries take it seriously, militaries do think about it. They do think about this issue. You have a lot of climate security strategy among a lot of European and NATO member states in Europe. It is something that is very front of mind for a lot of policymakers. But then you can ask, to which degree is it considered a priority among all armed forces across the continent? And that varies. For some, it's more front and center than others. And there's a wide host of reasons for that. You can't focus on everything at once, so you have to manage your resources wisely. I would say that there's been a lot of change on this topic over the past decade. It's become very closely integrated to how you think about your defense, but there's still a long way to go. So while there's this thought process going on, and you have a lot of climate security advisors or a lot of climate change thinking ingrained in a lot of military organizations, I don't think you're there yet. You see a lot of positive, strong initiatives linked to limiting the degree to which you pollute the environment when you conduct operations, being that through greater energy efficiency, etc., or through adaptation measures that you take to limit your own exposure. And countries are becoming more wise about that. You see a lot of countries that are now very focused on this resilience theme. And that's not a coincidence. The fact is that you do need to be more resilient as a society going forward, and that is something the militaries are very responsive to. So while I think that there has often been a bit of a narrative issue of climate change in militaries as why exactly is this our responsibility, this seems like more something that you deal with from a Ministry of Environment or Interior or economy if it comes to it. But I think it is very clear that while it's not your sole responsibility or duty, it does have ramifications for the work that you do, and you as a public institution also have a responsibility yourself vis-a-vis climate change and its impacts.
I mean, we can already see a lot of changes when it comes to the uniforms. They adapt the uniforms, they adapt other things like the vehicles or something. So there are some progresses and adaptations. Do you also think that there might come some new tasks or responsibilities for the military personnel regarding, for example, resilience, but also the rise of natural disasters that may come into account when we talk about CIMIC in the future? That there are some more skills needed, resources needed, more capabilities and more tasks for the CIMIC personnel?
Definitely. The one that springs to mind immediately is humanitarian assistance and disaster response. It's already a strain that's being placed on militaries. You see across the board, especially in Europe, how there is a greater strain put on armed forces to address natural disasters. You have an initiative by an American think tank called the MERCH Tracker, which tracks sort of military deployments in response to to natural disasters. And they are every year registering a global increase in military deployments related to natural disasters. So it's a global phenomenon. But you also see it in Europe in terms of the role that the militaries play, and they need to rethink exactly how this happens and how they dedicate resources to this. You have the largest military deployment in Polish history, for example, happened in response to a natural disaster. That says a lot. Yeah. And it also explains the degree to which this acts as a threat multiplier for societies and the risk that it puts us at. You have, and it does strain military resources as well. You've had in Canada over the past few years a quite public discussion between military officials and public servants about what degree of emphasis you put on on armed forces when responding to disasters. You see that military forces are already being stretched thin, that they're being asked to perform tasks that weren't necessarily part of their core mandate. But because they have a lot of useful training and equipment, they're often the first responders that people think of when it comes to this. And that has both implications for how we as a society think that we function and operate, because this has traditionally been more of a core civilian task. So what does it actually mean that armed forces are now being asked to pick this up? But you also have some very innovative responses to it. I mean, in Spain, you have dedicated military units that are specifically trained and geared towards forest fires. So you have a lot of multifaceted responses, and it's not all one way where militaries are being asked to pick up more slack. You also have the public response to this, or the political response to a lot of these disasters, trying to sort of alleviate the burden and to promote a more whole of society approach to addressing this. I mean, in Denmark, you now have a Ministry for Civil Preparedness. And this is a way of thinking that's becoming more and more popular. You can't, and this again relates to what I said earlier, you can't really operate in a silo. You are part of society, and ergo you have a contribution to the whole of society. Just as you also need more resources to fulfill those contributions. Yeah, then. So it's a bit of a seesaw and a bit of a tough issue on what exact demands we place on our armed forces and what resources we give them to solve those issues.
Yeah, you mentioned the MERCH tracker. I guess it's something available online that everyone can...
Yeah, this is a publicly available database. If you Google Merge Tracker, it's very, very useful. It's a map overview where a think tank in the US tracks individual deployments of armed forces across the world. It's publicly available information, and I'd encourage listeners to take a look at it. It's very interesting.
We will definitely link it, because I think it's also super interesting to just have a look at it and understand how many deployments are there actually already. But you also mentioned a lot of initiatives that already take place when it comes to the military taking part in disaster responses. Last year at the CIMIC event here at the CCOE, we had actually a Canadian person here talking about the Green Helmet initiatives. I don't know how much you know about this initiative, but it's also the military supporting with disaster response and actually having, certain people really dedicated to those, to work against the wildfires and so on. When I think of Germany, I think it's hard to have initiatives there as well, because I know how our system works. And if you have some disaster response, it goes through all levels and you formally have to request the military help and so on. So I would imagine that some countries still struggle with actually having the military as a support in disaster response. But I also think it's changing, because we see how important it is that we work together, as you said, whole of society, not working in silos and so on. So I think the mindset of the military towards climate change already is in progress, and we take on new tasks. But when we look from the civilian perspective, do you see some people taking up tasks and be like, okay, this is something the military has to do, even though it's not a military task? Is there some perception of the civil society on what should have or should be done by the military from now on?
That's a tough question, and also because it's so varied. I mean, I think you have a bit of a tough question in the sense of, if you ask armed forces to take a more proactive role in addressing things like natural disasters, you also need to factor in that they have another core task, which is national defense.
Yeah.
And the more emphasis you put on them as a civil response mechanism, the more you risk detracting from that other core task that they have, which is, I'd argue is a very core task too. You can't have one without the other. So I think that has been a bit of a tough question to answer, because, like you said, a lot of, especially NATO allied countries, they have more of a federal response system where you have a local response first that then has to go through the layers of government before you have a military intervention. It's a similar factor in Canada, where I live now, where it's often a provincial level response that starts first. Then you call in the federal government for support if it escalates, and then you call in the armed forces. The risk is that a lot of these disasters are developing so fast that this old model that used to work pretty well doesn't quite work that well anymore when you have record-breaking forest fires or flooding. So you need more faster-acting mechanisms that can take effect when it really gets bad. Often local responses in these cases are the best way to go forward, because you know the local situation, you know exactly what to do, everyone has a role, everyone has a connection with one another, communication is much smoother. And when you bring in a larger outside actor, that isn't always necessarily a positive. Immediately, throwing more resources at a problem doesn't necessarily solve it. It's also about how you use it. But in the case of a lot of these climate fuel disasters that we see taking place, we do need to rethink exactly how we address these questions, both in terms of the amount of resources we give armed forces if we expect them to respond, but also in terms of the timelines and the institutional mechanisms that we have for coordinating responses. How efficient are we, and where can we improve?
Yeah, definitely. Also talking about improvements and looking a little bit in the future, you also mentioned in the beginning melting of the poles and the Arctic opening up. When we look a little bit in the future, what do you think are the most important challenges for the military when we think about climate change and the struggles and challenges we have to face?
Oh, do I have to name just one?
You can take as many as you want.
Okay. I mean, I think I'm going to bring it back to sort of an adaptation versus mitigation discussion in that sense. And when I say adaptation mitigation, I mean both how do you adapt to changing circumstances and how do you mitigate your own impact. So I think that for militaries, a lot of the threats that they face often emerge in the form of adaptation. As a military, you're asked to operate in a wide variety of circumstances and geographies and territories. And that means that you need equipment that often needs to function from -40 to +50. Electronic equipment especially might not be able to do that in certain circumstances. And we've had cases in the past where NATO's an alliance is deployed to in hazardous conditions and our equipment hasn't functioned the way we want it to. A case in point being in Afghanistan, where you've had issues with helicopters maintaining lift because the air density hasn't been strong enough to really support it. So you have to recalibrate exactly how much weight you can carry. It's also been in the reliance of air conditioning systems for places that are experiencing high heat. The big killer in Afghanistan, for example, was fuel and water convoys, and the increased pressure that was placed on those systems to keep people comfortable and alive and functioning. So at some point, you ask yourself a critical question of how do you keep yourself ready and operational if you're located in an area that is predicted to experience record-breaking heat of 40 plus degrees for several weeks at a time. Because as an alliance like NATO, the need is that you are able to function and maintain readiness at all hours of the day, regardless of the conditions. And that's a pretty big ask across a wide array of geographies that NATO is. That means that you both need to be proficient in dealing with heat while also being able to deal with cold and everything in between. So that's really the big question for adaptation in NATO is that how do you create these solutions while making sure that everyone's still on board? Because you need to maintain interoperability, you need to maintain cohesion across the alliance. And when you introduce new solutions and technologies, you need to make sure that everyone is able to also make use of those tools. So the threat is really of individual responses that are not coordinated across the whole alliance. But I think that NATO as a whole has been pretty good at sharing information among each other and keeping each other up to date of what's going on. You do see ad hoc groups of member states forming to promote solutions. One of them being Casco, where, I mean, not every NATO ally is a member of it, but the whole alliance benefits from the work that we do of keeping everyone informed and promoting new developments and innovations. So I think that's one of the big issues. The other one being in regards to mitigation, this discussion of how do you, as a military, mitigate the impact that you have on the environment / climate. The military is a big polluter. And that's just a fact of the work that you do. And it's heinously difficult to decarbonize the activities of a military. So there's a lot of good initiatives going on. You've already picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Those being sort of stationary assets in terms of base infrastructure. Making your buildings more energy efficient has been a big driver, both in terms of environmental aspects, but also it's a cost-saving measure. Another one has been the integration of microgrids, which both serves a resilience and readiness purpose, but also helps to mitigate the impact that you have from the rampant use of diesel generators. So there are initiatives going on, but it is still a conundrum because a lot of the big questions in terms of how you sort of address climate as a military do still remain unsolved, and the technologies aren't quite there. So you're making efforts and you're also conscious of how you operate, but there is still a trade-off that needs to be made. And I think armed forces are very conscious in how they make those decisions. I think it's still a wicked problem and a tough ask for how exactly you solve them still.
Yeah, we were talking now a lot about equipment, but also the adaptation that NATO does when it comes to pollution and, having their buildings more climate resilient. Is it right to say climate resilient? But
yeah, in some ways.
But I also wondered if we have forces deployed to especially places where we have a high food scarcity or water scarcity. Would there be also like the trouble, or I mean, it also stresses the population there, the vulnerable population that is already there fighting the scarcity of food and water. I would also argue that a NATO deployment would also stress this even more, and it could also lead to the population not having the best impression of the NATO troops. Is there something that NATO can do towards this as well, especially when it comes to the preparation of the troops?
Well, that's a very tough question. I mean, you've seen it a lot with UN missions, especially that UN missions don't necessarily always have a positive presence in the on the deployments that they have. And they've learned from a lot of that. I think NATO also benefits a lot from this climate security learning that they've sort of inserted on themselves in the way that you've institutionalized it, because there is very much a do no harm principle. You don't want to deploy and make the situation worse. That's counteractive to your aims and your goals. I think it is that's a tough one, because I mean, a lot of the solutions that I mentioned earlier can also help to address some of these issues, because as a military, you don't want to place an undue burden on the public utilities, for example, for powering your base and etc. So I think a lot of these innovative energy efficiency solutions can help to mitigate that, so to speak. And that does help to go a long way. The other part is very much a public relations question, and I think that NATO as a military alliance with strong democratic political backing is quite well placed to address those questions and have open and frank conversations, even when things go wrong, to rectify mistakes and learn from them.
Yep.
So I think that in and of itself is also a very good step in that direction, and one of the strengths for dealing with a conundrum like that.
Yeah. I think also the awareness about the impact of the deployment in that region within the NATO troops is also something that is super helpful and valuable in this case. That leads me actually to my next question. Regarding adaptation when it comes to material, equipment, resources, personnel, and so on and so on. Do you think that climate change, or, well, not climate change itself, but the impact that climate change has on different regions should be a specific point in the education and training of NATO personnel?
Oh, it should definitely be a part of that. I mean, one of CASCO's core tasks is awareness raising and education and training. Our education and training pillar, like a lot of centers of excellence, is foundational to the work that we do. Part of CASCO's core task is to train and prepare NATO personnel and staff on what climate change means for their role. Now, what exactly that awareness raising and training looks like can be debated and discussed. Does climate change need to be its own core module when it comes to training certain personnel for a given role? Well, that depends. It definitely needs to be ingrained in the training that you give, because it relates and touches on so many topics. A core example of that being engineering. I mean, that is a lot of the engineering that you do is very dependent on the climate and the conditions that you operate within, especially for long-term planning. So I think that it varies, and I think a push that you also see in a recommendation that has also been brought up before has been a sort of you have environmental advisors, but also mainstreaming it in the form of climate security advisors. So that you have someone present on a deployment in an office that at least has this knowledge and this awareness that they can act as sort of a promoter themselves and help raise awareness themselves among troops and personnel about what the implications of climate change are in a given scenario. That's sort of the one of the ideal scenarios, because I mean, CASCO as an institution cannot train everyone, it cannot spread awareness to everyone. But what we can help to do is to sponsor individuals themselves in in making changes and in raising awareness. So it's sort of a knock-on effect, if you will, a spillover effect of the work that we do and the work that our national militaries do. And there's great variety of how exactly this topic is dealt with among national militaries. Some talk more about it than others. Some would probably talk about it, but use different terminology that doesn't necessarily mention climate. But then you talk about extreme weather, energy efficiency. So it varies. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter exactly how you teach, just as long as the message is getting out there. And for that, there's not a set module. It has to be a combination of tools that you use in your education and training box. So the trainings that Casco provide are a great tool. We try to reach a wide variety of personnel, both nationality and professional wise as possible, to ensure that the message is spread out and that they themselves internalize the message that we give them and pass it on to colleagues as well, or flag something if it doesn't align with the goals that NATO and its allies have set itself.
Yeah. I recently was taking part in a course where we also had kind of a climate change implications game to also see, okay, how does climate change affect the military and so on. And it was super interesting. And also these just, little games can help so much in just starting to think about, okay, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for the military? And why is it so important? So I think training and education is one of the core pillars to actually get everyone on board on tackling this problem, even if it's just something small.
Yeah, and I mean, if I can quickly promote some of our activities, then especially because it's my core competence in that sense, is that it doesn't have to be this very intense, serious training. It can also be a bit fun with gamification. So we're developing several war games at Casco aimed at raising awareness and educating personnel on the implications of climate change. The one that's taking shape now is a war game centered on the lessons learned in the Sahel, so more of a desertified scenario. And that we're doing in collaboration with the SFA COE, the Security Force Assistance COE, and Stability Policing COE, and MNS COE in Italy. So it's a multi-COE initiative aimed at both addressing at tackling climate change, but specifically towards different scenarios that are relevant for the trainings that other COEs give, so that it's not just limited to the expertise that we might have in-house, but that we pass it along to other COEs and empower other people to also do those things. And these war games are quite a lot of fun. You don't have to take it as easily, and I think it's also a much easier way of internalizing the message in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely.
And we plan on making more of these war games. The next one that we're doing will be on the Arctic as well, with a different set of partners. But that's really one of the core pillars of the work that we do, is this gamification as a tool.
Yeah. You mentioned that these games can be played at different COEs. Would you also be open to play those games at universities, for example? Because I always think that students especially are what comes next, Also, of course, students from universities, but also schools, high school, and so on. So I think it's also interesting for them maybe to have a little sneak peek into what you're doing, what you're teaching, and what you try to aim with those games.
Definitely. That's a great idea that I'll definitely bring on board, in the sense that, the more people we get to play these games, the better. And the intention of them is to both provide a good lesson, but also be simple enough that you don't need to be really into board games to understand all the mechanics and rules. The intention is really to reach a broad audience, to keep the mechanism simple. So this is a game that you can play over an afternoon and have fun with, in a sense, because I think that's the best learning tool that we can provide. So I echo what you say, definitely.
Okay. So for everyone listening from schools or universities, you know now whom to get in contact with. You mentioned the Arctic as well, that this is kind of the next topic of the next war game. I would assume that the Arctic and the environment there would be one of the next challenges we have to face when it comes to the changes due to climate change and how it affects the security environment. Do you see any other upcoming challenges that would be the most, or the ones we have to tackle first and most importantly in the next few years?
I mean, the Arctic is a great example just because of the nature of it. I mean, NATO as an alliance and the Arctic states are actively increasing their presence in the region. That comes with repercussions. You both need to consider the environment that you're deploying into and the environment that you're going to be deployed into in the next few decades, because it's changing. The Arctic is warming on average much faster than the rest of the world. It's affecting things beyond just the Arctic. The melting sea ice affects everything from sonar and radar to the degree of how you operate as a navy in the Arctic. Ironically, I've heard a lot of experts say that despite the ice melting up north, you will probably need more icebreakers in the future than you do now, simply because you're still going to have sea ice, but you're also going to need to deploy up there now. So in the medium term, you're definitely going to need more assets to deal with the cold, despite it on average getting increasingly warm. And it also poses several questions for existing infrastructure. I mean, a lot of what you've built in the north, especially in Canada, but also in countries like the Russian Federation, has been built on permafrost. And this is a permanently frozen layer of ice that's now progressively melting. And you've built roads, you've built airstrips, you've built bases on top of this ice. And the uneven sinking of the ground that comes with it means that walls start to crack, airstrips start to become uneven, and roads start to fall apart. So you need to invest immense resources in infrastructure up there to make sure that you maintain the presence needed to provide, to sort of preserve your objectives and to protect your national sovereignty. And that's a big concern and a big ask, because that's not cheap. Especially not in a remote territory where you have to bring all the goods up there, bring all the expertise up there, and then build. And it also raises questions of what responsibility do you have to local communities there, because you also don't, like we talked about before, you don't want to just deploy and put a stress on existing utilities and resources that other people depend on. It has to be done in collaboration with them to not just help defend them, but also provide a more positive influence on their lives. And you see that being a big discussion point, especially in Canada, where the big military investments you're making in the Arctic, the narrative that is being put forward and the policy emphasis has really been on doing it in collaboration with Indigenous peoples of the Arctic to make sure that this also works for them. You're not going to just build a road up in the Arctic and assume that it's only for military assets. No, so that will also be for public use, presumably. You also have to make sure that there's a net dividend and a net benefit on society as a whole from the investments you're making. So that the Arctic is really a big conundrum in that sense, and the amount of resources it requires will be quite high, but the net benefits from having a stable and secure Arctic are also very good. And another issue is really also the, I think in Europe you call it the southern neighborhood, sort of the southern flank of NATO across the Mediterranean. That presents a whole host of issues in terms of how do the NATO neighbors address climate security, and what sort of destabilizing effects do they suffer from it, and how does that spill over onto us? So I think that there's a lot of flanks and issues that come with climate change and the security ramifications that need to be addressed across the alliance, with some more emphasis on certain hotspots that are experiencing change faster than others. But in general, this is a whole of, like I said, this is a whole of society issue, and the response needs to be equally as grand to work.
No, I'm totally on your side there. Also, when it comes to the Arctic, with all the resources that are now available because of the melting ice, and the interests coming also in that area from various nations wanting to have a hand on those resources, and of course it changes the security environment, especially. But unfortunately, we are coming to the end of the episode, so I will ask you now to just sum up this episode with the 3 or 4 key takeaways for the audience that you think are most important for them to keep in mind after listening to it.
Oof, the final word. Let me think. Well, I think a big part of it is very much that this isn't happening that climate change isn't taking effect with no response happening. It's not that military institutions are deaf or ignore the issue. There's actually a very robust response ongoing, and it's picking up, despite what you might otherwise believe. And it is a priority area for a lot of armed forces. The tough question is more, how do we respond? And there, it's not just a question for militaries, but us as societies that ask, what do we want our public institutions to look like? What role do we want militaries to play going forward? Do we want them to be not just the guarantee of national sovereignty and of our defense, but do we also want them to play a more proactive role when it comes to humanitarian assistance and disaster response? Is that what we envision for ourselves? So I think that the big takeaway there is really a question that we should ask ourselves of, what do we want our armed forces to do? Because they're doing a lot, and we're dedicating more and more resources to it. So I think it's a very timely question to ask of, where do we go from here? Because militaries can do a lot, but they take political direction from, well, our elected officials, but also society as a whole. And they have to work in tandem with that. So I think that's a big one. The other one being that there are so many changes happening in the international arena that need to be responded to. And a lot of those responses will be affected by our climate, both for better or worse. So you're seeing a lot of internalization in among NATO allies, both in terms of what impact will climate have for my operations, but also how might we leverage our environment to become stronger and more resilient. You're seeing a lot of discussion on NATO's eastern flank, for example, about how we rewilding certain marshlands might actually help bolster NATO's defense plans for the region, especially in the Baltics and in Poland. Those are very poignant questions that show a lot of innovation is ongoing. I think the momentum just needs to be kept up in that sense, and to be pushed, and that we need to keep pushing for change. Because I think the idea that business as usual is a viable model is not realistic. That is a state of stagnancy that isn't going to help everyone. So we need to be ambitious in the type of change that we push for, and we need to keep doing it.
Very good points. I think they are very valid and very important questions as well for us to keep in mind, and especially also for the listeners. One final question. What does Beyond the Battlefield mean for you? As our podcast is called Beyond the Battlefield, I, of course, always want to know what our esteemed guests would see or would think that it means for me.
To me, Beyond the Battlefield means everything that goes on behind the scenes. If the battlefield or the work that the military does was compared to a theater play, the battlefield is the performance night. But you don't show up on performance night, start acting, and make a great show. You need months and months of preparation. You need to build the components that go on stage. You need to train yourself to perform the right roles. Beyond the Battlefield, to me, is everything that feeds into that one cohesive show. So the work of NATO and its allied forces is not just the battlefield. It's the logistics that goes into it. It's the training that we give our personnel. It's the collaboration that we do with society as a whole. So for me, it's really beyond this one big showstopper. It's all the work and emphasis and the training and the preparedness that we do as societies and as military institutions to be ready for any battlefield that we might find ourselves on.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate the answer. And thank you also to our listeners for turning in for another episode on Beyond the Battlefield, where we talked about climate change and the implications for NATO and all the allied forces. We see you next time when we talk about human security. Until then, take care and thank you for listening. You've been listening to Beyond the Battlefield, produced by the Civil Military Cooperation Center of Excellence and hosted by me, Sonja. The views shared here reflect personal expertise and experience and do not necessarily represent official positions. Thank you for listening and see you next time.